Welcome everyone to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I'm Kathy Group. I'm the Advertising Marketing Manager for HGA, and I'm your host today. Today, we are sponsored by the Austin School of Fiber Arts, whose mission is to share the knowledge and fiber and arts through master classes and through lectures. To learn more about all they have to offer, please go to the Austin School of Fiber Arts.org. We will take questions today. We always do. They'll be the last 15 minutes of the hour. And please put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. Love your comments in the chat, but if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A. Today, we have Kira Dominguez Hultgren. Kira studied French postcolonial theory and literature at Princeton University and performance and fine arts in Río Negro, Argentina. She has a dual degree of an MFA, MA in fine arts and visual and critical studies from the California College of Art. She traveled to Patagonia with a women's storytelling troupe where she apprenticed with a master weaver, Mary Corrado, and studied the process and history of indigenous warped face weaving on a Mapuche vertical loom. Her work has been featured in the July-August 2020 issue of Architectural Digest. Kira is also a part-time faculty member at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in Fiber and Material Studies. Welcome, Kira. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you, Kathy. It's great to be here.
Well, we always start off with our favorite question, which is, what is your favorite tea?
I think it's a three-way tie between cha, mate, and then Earl Grey.
All right. That's an interesting combination of those three.
Right.
So how did you get started in fibers?
Well, you know, I was one of these really lucky kids, actually, whose parents just encouraged my hobbies just tremendously. And so I was able to take sewing and quilting lessons from a very young age. I started a men's tie and hat business, these crazy ski hats in the late 80s, early 90s. So my parents were sort of giving me the money to start funding this business. And then it was up to me to sort of sell enough to see if I could get my own sewing machine and my own serger. And I just absolutely just loved doing anything with my hands, really. And so it wasn't until actually much later after I had had kids and finished college, I was living in Argentina and came across a weaving collective that I had already sort of learned how to do a little bit of tapestry weaving, a little backstrap weaving, sort of through the years, but sort of walking in and meeting the women in this collective, and then just started drinking mate with them. Tea really was the kind of like grease that that skidded the wheels or bound us together, sort of all the way through for over a year. And then after that, as we were talking, they would hand me wool, and I would be carding wool with my hands and learning how to do that. And then they're like, well, you're just sitting there. Why don't you learn how to spin? And so it was like, okay. So I started learning how to spin wool. And then they're like, well, today we're going to wash the wool and we want to teach you how to dye it. So they sort of like started taking me through this process while we were hanging out. And my sort of motivation for being there was to listen to stories. I had sort of never encountered professional, what I now consider sort of professional weavers, right? Who were not just making their living, but telling their stories through material. And it just was very eye-opening. And so we were living there. My kids were the first time they were in school, so I had some time. And so, yeah, and it was good language practice for me. So there was sort of a lot of reasons why I was there. And I had no idea that it was going to lead all the way to one day, one of the women were like, I think you're ready. We're going to teach you how to weave. And it was like, oh wow. My goodness. Okay. And it was just absolutely from the very like basics, that for them, weaving is the last step that comes after so much has gone in to preparing the fiber, and understanding sort of the relationship that you're coming to the loom. And looms are sticks. They're sticks sort of like tied together, put together, and oftentimes tree trunks that have been intricately carved and sort of have a whole history to themselves. So inheriting a loom among these women meant sort of having the logs and sticks that were passed from either mothers, grandmothers, further back, or trades, right? They would weave a poncho in exchange for somebody, a woodworker, to sort of carve these sort of beautiful sticks for them, or it was an old broom handle. It was whatever was on whatever was available to sort of create your loom, and that was going to create the tension. You would learn about your yarn and what kind of how well you had spun it. Certain, yarn was used for different kinds of weaving, and it all depended on sort of how much tension. Scissors were never used. I never was allowed to touch scissors the whole time I was living in Argentina, because everything's hand spun. You should be able to unspin and break the wool, right? And fringe has a very interesting relationship to whether or not that's waste, or whether it should be in the weaving. So all these sorts of things. It was there was a whole wonderful kind of experience and culture that I got to step into learning about through weaving. And it just was kind of mind-bending to me, especially the sort of part where I found out, well, they're presented as Mapuche weavers, a Mapuche weaving collective. And yet they all have a very different, like the different women that were there. Marie Coronado was the one who ran the collective relationship to what that meant to be Mapuche. And that was sort of, for me, very eye-opening, because I had grown up between so many different cultures, living in the US, having a US passport, having parents that were not, did not identify first as American, and then did. And so what that meant to have, to be sort of existing in so many different places and find somebody who had a very similar experience, but completely different, all the way in Argentina, of what it meant to sort of represent a culture and yet not really comfortably occupy that position. So.
Well, let me do a follow-up question then, because you studied fiber at California, right?
Right.
Well, what was that then to shift gears? Because that's not necessarily,
no.
I mean, a lot of my friends, fellow weavers, we weave, and then we want to figure out how to do spinning, and then we want to figure out. So was that a culture shock for you that when you studied in the US?
Yes, no, absolutely. And that was when we moved back to the US, what was very eye-opening was realizing, this is a whole different approach to weaving, that, the sort of yarns and where the yarns are coming from may or may not be of interest. Sort of the first step, often it feels like with weaving, is, as you said, you start with a loom and you learn how to weave. And then after that, maybe you step more and more sort of backwards into the fibers. The thing I really appreciated because of the way that I learned how to weave was that the structure then of what a loom was allowing me to do felt like I was suddenly handed like a power tool when I had been trying to use like a hand tool my whole life, you know? And so I realized, oh, it's doing the same thing, but now I don't have to pick up every strand with my hands. Like, oh, I can, if I'm weaving a 30-inch wide fabric, this is so much easier on a floor loom. I understand. The sort of flip side of that was my experience then with weaving was very sort of low budget. I was able to enter into weaving without much expense, which I feel like is a big hurdle for a lot of people that I've encountered. I mean, taking up sort of the SUV size floor loom in your living room is hard to do. And so I appreciated having sort of sticks as a loom to kind of be my first method. But then I also realized there's advantages to being able to weave on a floor loom. It allows different things. So being able to have both experiences was really helpful. And then obviously entering into a conversation of contemporary art kind of completely changed the way that I also approached my own making, realizing that this sort of experience of considering kind of handwork, a craft or a hobby, something to keep me busy. And the reason why I really related to a lot of older women, especially when I was like 10 and 11 and kind of going to these quilting guilds, was I realized, oh, there's this whole history there that's intersecting with feminism that I had never appreciated until much later. So it was great to sort of allow that conversation to find a lot of historical roots and basis, as well as just a lot of other artists to sort of realize, wow, this is not a unique experience. This is actually coming out of a lot of women and artists who have come before me who have just completely opened up space within contemporary art and within craft to express myself this way. So yeah.
Well, talking more about your work, and I see we have some behind you, is that when I look at your work, I think about how it's kind of like deconstruction rather than construction, because there's often either parts were taken out or maybe they were never there to begin with. Right. So how did you go from kind of a traditional kind of weaving to a more abstract weaving? How did that happen for you?
Yeah. Well, like I was saying, in Argentina, there was a lot of rules, right? Like no scissors, and fringe was like, well, the fringe is going to catch the rain. So why would someone want fringe in their poncho? It'll be too heavy. So like, well, they're going to request weaving without fringe. And if you're weaving if you start your warp and it's a figure 8 and there are no heddles that you have to sort of cut the warp to remove from because you're putting the heddles in as you go, then you can have a fringeless weaving, right? And so that was sort of all this, like a lot of reasons, culture, practical, history, memory, so many reasons why people were doing the kind of weaving they were doing. Then realizing, wait a second, none of that is coming through to a contemporary art audience. Like I'm in school and I'm struggling so much to like, I want to like, maybe what it was is I care deeply about sort of either deciding, do I put the fringe in, do I not? And that was just not a consideration, right? Or I'm going to use all hand spun wool, and that doesn't actually register sort of to most viewers. That's what's hand spun versus what's acrylic. And so for me, it became, oh, well, if I make it bigger, then maybe they can see it. Or if I leave this unspun, then they know that actually it was hand spun, because this is not something a machine can do. So sort of realizing, as I purposely left ends exposed, the process becoming part of the work, that became a language that people could see, and I could start talking about. It sort of led me back to ways that I would want to talk about the work. One thing I really appreciated is that so much of weaving that I saw, and that the textiles I grew up with, so my mom's family's from India, and a lot of the weaving, the khadi, the brown cotton fabric, is woven in parts, right? Because if something's woven on a backstrap loom or sort of a not super strong floor loom, the narrower the width, the easier it is to manage. And so weaving sort of in strips and then sewing those together to make a bigger sort of bedspread or, whatever, made a lot of sense, as well as for washing, right? If you don't have a washing machine or any way to clean a finished fabric that's that wide, it's important to have the seams so that the user can take it apart, wash it, and sew it back together. So, and that's sort of something I feel like a lot of people then, like the next generation, learns how to do, to take apart and put back together, which for me became a beautiful metaphor, because I like what was most interesting to me was all of these textiles I would inherit, because everyone sort of knew from a young age, oh, she's the one that loves fabric. So this is no longer useful. We don't really want to show this or use this for holidays. It's been stained one too many times. It's been ripped here. We'll give it to Kira. Maybe she can do something with it. And I loved that, because I was inheriting all of these like wholly frayed textiles that, to me, all of those moments were just showing part of my family history and journey, right? Like as much as what was originally stitched or put into the fabric. And so it was the kind of fray and the stain and the hole and the way that it had to be pulled apart to be cleaned and put back together, so then showed the use. That was all part of the process. And that was sort of where I wanted to, I felt like as the next generation, then that was where my kind of care and tending of these family textiles would take place. So instead of actually taking apart and washing them, taking them apart, but putting them back together, and sort of where do I allow a story to kind of become contemporary and present in this generation, and how do I share that? So those were the parts where it was very interesting. And then my dad's family's from Mexico, and so it was also this kind of thing where the two cultures didn't necessarily, I mean, they actually, there's similarities, but it was the idea of, well, I'm not going to actually be able to tell this Indian story in any kind of way that reflects like my great aunt's experience or that reflects my dad's experience. So why don't I just sort of put them both together and see what happens, or bring in a material that I would consider uniquely me, you know, and like the climbing gym rope is really heavy and pulls against things, but also I think shows where material is like being hidden or being exposed. So it's the metaphor kind of moving with the material that then allows me to tell the story. Again, kind of going back to what I saw in Argentina, that these women were telling stories through the act of weaving, through the sort of like performance process of the action. So,
well, your work is very complicated in many ways, in that excuse me, that not all of the pieces that you make are nice and neat and they go on a rod and you hang it on the wall. And then I was curious about, when you start weaving, are you planning ahead knowing, okay, I'm going to have to do this in order to make it work? Or is it more spontaneous? For example, in the work A Rose, you have the weft hanging off the sides there. They kind of go off to the sides. So when you were weaving, were you thinking, well, if I weave it this way, I'm going to have to figure out a way to design something to hang it? Or was that just not your concern until you got done?
Yeah, well, so a little bit of both. The green kind of climbing gym rope that's going through the middle of it, and that crosses, so it's woven in 8 parts, right? So the 8 different lines that are going through, that I had to plan ahead of time. So to appreciate, like, where was I going to end this, to leave the rope long enough to then start the next piece. So the end of one became the beginning of the next. And I warped it in four long warps. So each piece then would have, was the equivalent of sort of 2 of those sections. And as I was weaving, I was purposely thinking about ahead of time where I was going to kind of stop weaving to get the kind of diamond shapes that were, or the fins that were being created. But yeah, so the rope was the kind of limiting factor there then, that it was like, all right, I'm going to have at least 4 pieces that are going to be connected to the other. And if I hate it, I'm going to leave a long enough piece that I can cut it apart and do something totally different. But I'm hoping it will work. We'll find out. So then the orange rope that's going around the outside of the whole thing, that was, I ran out of the green and I knew I was going to. And so the orange enters in on that white panel, and and it was I didn't need much of it. So I knew I was going to have a lot left. And again, it was like, all right, well, I can cut it off afterwards, or I can use it as part of the installation and how I'm going to hang this piece, because I wanted it. I didn't actually know it was going to look like this. I wasn't quite sure what it was going to look like, but I had hoped that I could sort of, the goal was, all right, if I have 8 weavings and they're connected in the middle, ideally I can stretch it out in some way that it will like be able to hold its structure. And maybe it's just against the wall, I'm not sure. But with all this extra orange rope, I've done a lot of like macrame, and then in climbing, this lark heads knot is a very common one, because you can just twist it over itself and slide a bar into tension. So doing that, I had enough to go all the way around. And a lot of times sort of the next step, and it's the step I'm actually on in this piece too, where it's like I finished a weaving and now it's like I need to go to a reuse building supply store to figure out what lumber I can get that will work to sort of what I consider construct my loom, right? So the way that I approached weaving was through sticks. This too, even though it's a square, it's like, oh, this is a square peg loom. Okay, how do I do that without the nails? Like which bars will hold? How will it interact with the rope? Will it be too heavy? Will it bend? Can I then tie all of these extra warp strands to the bar to create more tension and create this shape? So it was like a guessing game. And the cam straps are something that I use a lot in the studio just because they're also very useful. But then realizing I really loved this like orange, because it did look a lot like the orange silk that's often used in pulkari embroidery, which is what this is based off of. And so yeah, so then deciding, oh, actually the cam straps really work. What if I make it a little more aesthetic than like this blue and black cam strap I'm using in the studio, things like that. So it's sort of, it's a step-by-step process. So some things are, limiting at the beginning, but others, I often try to leave myself enough room to decide, okay, it's going to get cut apart or it's going to move in a totally different direction.
Well, how big was that piece?
That piece is 10 foot by 10 foot. It's a square. Oh, yeah. Wow. And then with the cam straps, I guess it gets bigger. It's installed right now at the San Jose Museum of Quilt and Textile. And that's, I think it's a 18-foot wall. So the cam straps can take it and then tension it out quite wide.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. All right. So we can go see it right now.
Yes. Yeah. It's
yeah.
Up until the 12th. So that show installed the week that everything shut down in March of 2020. Oh, so wow. I'm there with the curator and the staff, and we're installing this piece, and we're saying, we don't even think we can have an opening reception. Like it doesn't feel responsible. And then the governor came in and said, nope, everything shut down. It was like, okay, well, there you go. It's out of our hands. Yep. And so then the museum was closed actually up until this summer. So the show was up, but was not available to be seen for over a year. And then they opened this summer, and it's been up since then. So now it's coming down in a week. So I know, but I'm actually kind of excited to get the piece back too.
Will you change it at all, or is it done?
I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. I want to see what condition it's in after, being up for. Yeah. I don't think I could have asked for a better sort of place to keep it for a year and a half within a museum. But yeah, I want to see, because especially I've noticed certain pieces that get installed again and again. It's wool, it stretches. And so where is the tension different than the way that I experienced it the first time? How is everything doing? So kind of doing some upkeep, but no, that piece feels pretty finished.
Okay.
Yeah. Other pieces I get back and I'm like, yes, I can change the whole thing. I don't have to look at it like this anymore.
Well, in this, excuse me. In this next piece, this is a large scale installation called Cosmic Fluff. And it's from an exhibit called The Untitled Art. And I love this, you brought in rigid heddle looms and a backstrap loom for the public to weave on. Can you talk about why you chose for the public to have this kind of experience, this hands-on experience?
Yeah, so Facebook approached me and wanted to think about empathy. And how does weaving and webs, like sort of internets, create empathy rather than kind of social isolation, which is the way we normally think about internets. Which, I wasn't quite, I'm not a tech person. I don't know if I can, or a sociologist, I don't know if I can comment on that, but I can sort of think about the way that webs and nets as a material connect people. And so the sort of experience that I definitely wanted to try to give to people as far as empathy was sort of not necessarily recreate my experience with Marie, but at least sort of think about the way that she had activated some sort of knowledge, right? That was in my hands, that was in me. And so thinking about what are our bodies carrying around that we don't necessarily use every day, but that we could, given the right tools or sort of prompts, start moving with material in this way. And so the way that I got to spend time with her through conversation while using my hands, I wanted to give that experience to viewers so that instead of talking with me while looking at this piece on the wall, what if we actually helped create the piece together? So those appendages that are coming off to the side started growing through these backstrap looms. People were tensioned. You can see some of the backstrap looms kind of hanging on the back of the wall there next to the piece. So I had several of these looms. People would then weave. I'd be talking to them about my story and about their story and whether they'd ever woven before. I heard a lot about people's grandmothers, which was amazing. I loved that. And so we were weaving, and then once sort of enough people had woven on a loom and it was a fabric, then I'd switch it out. We'd have a new loom up, and then that piece would get attached to the wall so that at the end of the fair, these appendages on one side had grown over one side of the wall and sort of was draping down. And what was really great was people had a totally different experience with looking at weaving once they had woven, right? And so for some people, they didn't want to try the backstrap loom. So then the rigid heddle loom was available. That could feel a little bit more comfortable because it's not attached, around your body. And it gave people a little bit more freedom. There's less having to manage, right? I feel like the backstrap loom is so much about feeling the tension. And the rigid heddle loom is way more about color and material. You can kind of start accessing those things more quickly without having to worry about the tension, since the loom is doing the work for you that way. So I had set up looms for people to kind of experiment on the rigid heddle, and had a wonderful assistant who helped me with that. So Margot.
That's amazing to come in to see an exhibit and then you're part of it too. You make part of it, and what you did is up there. I bet that was very impactful for all the people who showed up. It would be for me. I would be like, oh, wow.
Well, and what was really curious was sort of to see a lot of tech people, right? This was in San Francisco,
yeah.
Facebook booth. And so like I have a lot of ways that I talk about weaving, but they also have a lot of ways they talk about weaving, right? As far as nets and webs and technology, fibers, and thinking about then their experience in how they were connecting it to virtual reality. And it was really interesting to sort of hear a completely different community approach weaving. And yeah, I mean, similar to my experience within contemporary art and weaving versus Handweavers Guild and weaving, it's very different, so.
Well, you did research on an image that you found at the, about a Navajo woman who was accompanying her husband as part of a delegate to Washington, D.C. in 1874. And this was at the Historic Museum, correct?
The National Museum of the American Indian, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I got that completely wrong. So the image on the left was her work, correct? Right. And then this is what inspired you to do the one on the right. So right. Can you talk some about just that whole experience, what you saw, what you thought of, yeah, and why you wanted to use this piece?
Right. So it's interesting because the piece that I saw, this image was used as the catalog cover for this exhibition that was about treaties. It was called Nation to Nation at the National Museum of the American Indian. And I was very intrigued when I saw the image, because if you look really closely, you can see that the heddle rod is in the back of the weaving, which means that this was not the side facing the weaver. So my first impression was, why are they showing the back? Is it because like it makes the US flag look like it's in the right orientation? Like what like, or was that the intention of the weaver? Like, was that the side? I don't know. But as I started doing research on this weaving, what was fascinating to me was the image that's in most textile histories. Sort of Kate Peck Kent, the textile anthropologist, sort of known for chronicling a lot of Navajo weaving through the 1950s. The image is by Charles Bell. He was a photographer for the US Department of the Interior in DC, took images of the Navajo delegation as well as this weaving then. And you can see where, you know, this is right during the time of the centennial. The US is trying to sort of create this narrative about the American West and the sort of pacification of the American West, as well as this is during the time of the Civil War, create a lot of like, you know, good feelings about the US. And so having a Navajo weaving that's a flag was going to do that. As I started seeing these images, what I realized was this was a commissioned work, most likely, by the US federal government to ask that Navajo weaving be done as this flag. But what was, and then was the picture that was taken then was this black and white image by Charles Bell. That image was what was reprinted then through all the catalogs. Sort of all the history around it was that black and white image, and Juanita's in it, and the federal Indian agent is in it. And it's like, why are you showing that image versus the image of the actual piece? And it was because the Smithsonian had lost the actual piece. They had gotten it in 1874, took these images, lost the actual piece in the sort of archives, and it wasn't rediscovered until the early 2000s. So then now we have these wonderful color images of this, the piece, but before it was all black and white. The thing that's striking to me seeing this color image is the warp, right? That it has this like blocked color warp on a tapestry weaving. And why in the world would a weaver do a color warp on a tapestry weaving? It gets completely covered. There's no fringe, like there's no reason that you would ever see this. And because of where the heddle and shed rods are, you can see that's woven from both sides, right? Going towards the middle. Probably the weaver wove the US flag first, flipped it over, and then wove the bottom part, the horizontal, and then those zigzag vertical stripes. Because of where the heddle rod and the shed rod are placed, I'm making that assertion that that's probably the way it was constructed. Which to me is like, well, there's something going on there then than just like a US flag. Why use the color warp? Why purposely weave it towards the middle to leave this warp exposed? Those colors are almost the same colors as those zigzag stripes. Is this weaving actually two flags? Is it about those zigzag stripes? Is it about the buried warp? Like is the US flag burying a sort of different story or different warp, right? Different material that's being covered over as it's constructed. So thinking about all these ways that I feel like this weaving is doing things that haven't really been talked about. Now, these are like, that's like my forensic interpretation, right? I'm like going in and deconstructing, right? Like what I think is happening based on this, which is absolutely has nothing to do with Navajo weaving or the Navajo weaver's intention or anything like that. But for me, then what it became was this black and white image, right, of the piece that went through the textile histories. It's the Charles Bell sort of image of what this piece did within history that to me became what I wanted to sort of tell that story, that Loom with Textile actually is about the way the US wanted to position Navajo weaving in the same way then this flag is like burying that color warp, and how does the image of the flag actually tell a different story or not tell the whole story of what I see happening in this whole weaving as far as what's being buried and what's being sort of seen. The zigzag stripes for me also are very much, reflective of northern Mexico and the Saltillo steppe serape blankets that were sort of going back and forth with all the trading posts. And so is this actually a weaving about the sort of like challenges and changing of Navajo weaving as it has to, as it sort of takes in different sorts of weaving from Mexico and the US, or is it sort of challenging both and sort of creating its own kind of narrative and have its own relationship to these images, to these patterns that's not Mexican and that's not US, you know, like, I don't know. So for me, this is, I guess, where, especially using the jacquard loom then to think about textiles and the image of textiles within history is what becomes the question for me, sort of how does it influence the way people see my weaving, or how do I as a weaver weave in the US with this history of Navajo weaving and the way that it's been positioned and used. So, yeah.
Well, in this next work, it says at least both your parents are brown. It's like your voice and your personal experience and your social comments come through, you know, loud and clear. So would you talk some about this piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the X in the middle, or that check mark in the box, for me has always been this point of contention of trying to figure out, where do I position myself? You know, I can say like my mom's family's from India, my dad's family from Mexico, but actually it's not even that simple. It's like, well, my dad is, you know, like Mexican, which means it's like my great grandmother was indigenous, and like my mom is Indian, but actually her family's Hollywood Hawaiian, and we're like black and white in the early 1920s. And it's all very sort of convoluted. None of it is clear, which means that the kind of, anytime I'm forced to kind of check a questionnaire box, I'm like, I don't know what to do. I can put them all, I can put other, I can put multi, like, where does this, again, like, what is it doing to my story, to future generations stories, to sort of allow this position or identification to happen. And so that's one of my cousins, so is her dad is black, mom is Indian, my aunt, and so phenotypically then she presents sort of differently than I do to the world. And what does that mean for her then to have to experience kind of a black and brown identity versus two brown identities? And so that's where this piece came from. When we were like 10, we'd be having these conversations, and she's like, well, at least both your parents are brown. And it's true, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was just like, at first I'm just like, well, that's not fair. Sure, but they're like totally different from one another. But now looking, I'm like, oh no, that's, I understand where she's coming from. Of course, like her experience in the US was totally different than my experience in the US and the way that people saw her. And so thinking through then what it means to be brown or black or white or any of these colors, right? That sort of it's hard to hold any of them to one definition. So using the kind of log cabin quilt strategy of turning the squares and putting them back together. This was woven on one long warp, but then was cut apart in four parts. And then it was actually tapestry woven, which is again sort of a silly strategy when you have a horizontal line, like why weave it in tapestry? There's zigzag stripes stepping through. And the reason was I wanted to put in brown belts, brown leather, sort of emphasizing again the body, as well as then how both within gender as well as race, how kind of like these professional they're Spanish leather brown belts contrast with the hand spun and industrially spun wools that are making up the piece, and sort of what material is appropriate for which construct of identity, right? And where can those intersect, and where is their movement? So, yeah.
Well, this is kind of a good segue into the next question, which is, I'm always curious when an artist is making a social comment, is how do you balance the visual decision versus the social statement decisions? You know, right. How do you choose between making, oh, we got to do it this way because it'll look better, but we want to do it this way because it makes a stronger statement? How do you find that balance for you?
So for me, I guess I approach the structure of a piece based on the kind of comment or what I'm wrestling through identity-wise. So thinking about the way that a piece is made is actually the way, and so then visually the way it will look is actually reflective of the kind of social comment I want to have. So is this going to have invisible cuts through it that only I can see, but that allows me a certain movement? Is this going to have so many materials packed into it that it's sagging? Or is this going to be a sort of so big that it's going to confront somebody and they're going to have to either like stand back or look or move their body in a certain way, right? So the a lot of that decision actually is the same decision for me. Thankfully, I haven't ever had this sort of like moment where I'm like, oh my goodness, I wish I could make it look this way, but because I want to talk about race in America, I can't. Like that's yet to happen. Sort of the reason why I like weaving and is because it does allow for these kind of contradictory vocabularies and materials and histories to kind of quite literally collide and see where things get pulled apart and where things are dependent on one another. They can't exist without the other, right? So, yeah.
Well, because you're teaching at the School of Art Institute of Chicago.
Yep.
So how does, because I've heard other people talk about how this impacts on their doing their own artwork. So how does that impact on what you are doing for you when you're also trying to teach?
Well, it's great because so the class I've been teaching is an intro class, which means that we're covering like different textile techniques every week. And the one thing that for me, weaving has always been a little bit like, I love it. And every time I've tried something else, like quilting, soft sculpture, I got to work with Leah Cook for a little while at CCA. And one of my favorite conversations was when I first walked in and I showed her all these things I was working on in the studio. And she looks at me, she's like, well, you know, that's nice, but I really think you should stick with weaving. Like, ouch, but okay. Like, and so it was clear what she was trying to say is it seems like weaving is allowing you to work in the studio in the way that you do and have the conversations you want to have. And the other stuff, sure, but maybe not quite there yet. and she did not mean technique. She meant like the way that we communicate, right? Like what is doing the work for you and what isn't. And so with students though, now I get to do all of those techniques every week. And so we can do spinning and we can do dyeing. And this week I'm so excited because we're preparing, you know, the onion dye basket, and I get to show them how alum affects it versus an iron mordant and doing logwood and all kinds of things. So that part's really fun. And then the other side of it is also seeing what's really important to me. And I see it in my students' work in the same way I see it in my kids, where it's like, oh, that actually is what I keep communicating and I'm not hearing it. And one of the things is what I see in the students' work is a lot of material that they have at hand, right? That's just like lying around, sort of reusing sort of what's been discarded or considered not useful anymore. And it's something that I do all the time in my work, but it's never something that I've actually really thought through, right? Like conceptually, I don't emphasize that. And yet it's absolutely there. And so to see that in the students, I've got just amazing work, because just people sewing their trash that they collected in their dorm room for 2 weeks and painting on top of it. I've seen like soft sculptures exploring the body in all kinds of different ways with scrap material that they found on a garbage run. Like it's great. Like, so that part really is encouraging, that it's like, oh, good. Like that there's a message there that, or a way that I've practiced using a lot of materials that have been just found on the ground that I can pass along to my students in all of these different ways. So that part's very encouraging and has given me sort of a lens to see the work differently and think about, well, maybe I need to start exploring that more intentionally.
Well, you mentioned Leah Cook, and she's very familiar to a lot of folks. Can you talk a little bit about, because you did a residency that's named after her, right? Right. Can you talk some about that residency and how did that impact your work?
Right, so that's on the jacquard loom at CCA, and so they call it the Leah Cook residency because she brought the jacquard loom to CCA, and then of course is one of those foundational kinds of weavers that sort of bridged technology and craft and showed us all that it's actually the same thing. So, and it was one thing that I really loved about working with her is that her work is so visual, right? She's weaving photographs most of the time on the jacquard loom. And yet her structures, her woven structures are so complicated. And I absolutely loved being able to sort of have those conversations with her of where does the structure allow her to create the image, even if no one necessarily realizes like how much time she's put into the structure, what it allows her to do. And since then, she's been able to sort of like, she bring a lot of the structure I felt like was more apparent in her earlier work that was off of the jacquard loom in the 70s. But then now she's kind of bridged those two together, showing the kind of the way that people see the textile is affecting their brain, even if they don't realize it. And now she's going to take that brain imaging. She's been doing a lot of brain mapping and put it back into her weaving. So she's allowing the structure to influence the way people see, and now letting the people's vision influence the structure, which I just think is totally fascinating. Yeah. So, and that's her current work. So I totally recommend go look at her website. It's great. So.
Check that out. All right. I love this question because there's no right or wrong answer, but if you could sit down with an artist, dead or alive, no matter who would it be? You're going to have a conversation with them. Who would it be? And then the next part of that is, would you talk about the art's meaning? Would you talk about your techniques, theirs or yours? Or would you think you would focus more on color and use of color?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. There's so many different artists I would say. One that I've really been thinking a lot about is Priya Ravish Mehra is an Indian artist. She passed away in 2018. And she's super inspiring because she was a textile expert as far as looking at Indian textiles, well, sort of beyond that, but especially around this idea of mending. Rafugari is a technique. Rafugars are artists who take the holes within fabrics and sort of either bring them back together or exacerbate them to make them part of the art, right? So that the hole and the fray becomes just that much more beautiful, becomes the art within a textile. Mm-hmm. And so Rafugar is a tradition that are artists that exist sort of in India and Afghan, Pakistan, sort of all over. Priya's work, she went and sort of studied the Rafugars, but also grew up with Rafugari artists. And so wanted to bring both the technique as well as then that history into contemporary art. And so she is a well-known contemporary artist. You can sort of look up her art, her work. The spelling of her name, in case anyone's running.
That's what they're all asking right
now. Is Priya. Ravish is Ravish. And Mehra is Mehra. And so her work, she took paper pulp and did these amazing weavings where the weft was oftentimes paper or fiber pulp that was put into these amazing warps. And so thinking about the sort of holes and the way she was filling in, the way that the holes allowed sort of to her experience both brokenness as well as mending. She passed away from cancer, actually. So it became a very sort of prescient story for her in the later part of her life. But I would love to sit down and talk with her about actually the question of what it felt like for her to tell and think about family stories, family textile traditions in so many different contexts. So that meaning of where she was a contemporary artist and she was studying with family Rafugar artists, as well as then looking at Rafugari around the world and sort of what her experience was in all of those different contexts.
If people want to know more
about her, so
if people want to know about this, they're still asking. Can they go to your website and get information? Is any of this listed on your website?
Mehra's work, no, I don't have any of her work on my website.
But I mean, do you mention the person?
I don't. I haven't even mentioned her. I haven't really done any work that I would say that's like referencing Rafugari. A lot of so Rafugari, is Rafoogari or Rafugary. Yeah. So Rafugari, the art of Rafugari is the technique.
Thank you, Preeti. Somebody just put it up. Thank
Nice.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, if you look her up, there's extensive information on her practice, images, all her textile research. I think she spoke. Did she speak? People have spoken about her at the Textile Society of America symposiums, like all of that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Well, what's next for you?
A lot of different things. One thing I have, yeah, so that's good. I'm teaching, and then I have a contemporary art exhibit happening at Untitled in Miami later on this year, and then at Kent State, which has an amazing textile program.
I do.
I am in a show called Line by Line, and there's some amazing artists that are going to be in that show. Erin Riley and Diedrich Bracken, and it's So that show is January to March. It's a group show. And then I'm working with a gallery in New York right now, putting together an exhibit where we're going to look at a historical object, and I'll respond and sort of put those things in conversation. So I'm excited to be able to do that, and that's sort of all in the beginning stages. So just making lots of making in the studio, teaching. Yeah.
Now you list where your work is, so when all this comes to fruition, people can go on your website.
Yeah, right. So Instagram is where I announce things. And then if you sign up for my newsletter, I'll send out a newsletter maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I'm not the best at social media. My mom actually takes care of all of my social media.
Your mom?
Wonderful.
All right.
Yes.
She is the other way around.
Yeah, no, I know. She is my Instagram, person. So that's wonderful. So anyway, so announced that way. And then after the exhibition, I've been trying to update my website, especially because I feel like a lot of what my practice is trying to tell these stories. And so using it as a way to sort of put more and more textile stories out there into the world. So that would happen kind of after, but yeah.
Well, we got a couple of questions. We're almost out of time, but I want to see if I can get to a couple of these. Early on, when you were talking about the piece, I think the first one arose. Somebody was asking, what kind of straps are you saying? She says, it sounds like CAM, like CAM straps. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, CAM straps. I often tell people when they ask what my favorite yarn store is, I'll say Home Depot, because I love those kind of materials. I love rope and chains and straps, and so. All right.
That's good. Where can we see your work? Mary Holm wants to know, where can we see your work? Where are you showing right now?
So right now I have a couple shows up in the Bay Area. So one at San Jose Museum of Quilt and Textile, and one is at the St. Joseph Art Society in San Francisco. It's this beautiful restored church called Becoming. The Bedford Gallery in Walnut Creek just took a textile show on the road. So I think their first stop is in Florida. Towards the end of the year. So if you go onto the Bedford Gallery's website, they will have that. And I also will put all of this too on Instagram and my webpage. So that's what's up currently, not forgetting anything. And then the next shows that will be coming up, the Kent State one in Ohio is the beginning of the year. And then at the end of the year in Florida and Miami at the art fair, Untitled. And then I'll have a couple more shows, then have one in New York and one in San Francisco in 2022. So so kind of just a little bit everywhere.
That's good. We love it.
It is good. I get to keep weaving, that's sort of all I ask. I'm like, I just need enough encouragement to make the next piece. That's sort of all I really want out of this. So it's great.
Now, talk some about the piece right behind you. People are going to be asking about that.
Yeah, so this is, I'm thinking about she was a weaver, but also the model for Diego Rivera, Fernando Leal, Jean Chabot, so the Mexican modernist, Luz Jimenez was her name. And she is sort of best known, I feel like, in US audiences as the flower girl in a lot of Diego Rivera's paintings. So the one holding the calla lilies, you see the back of her braid a lot of time. And painted her, photographed her throughout her life, but because she was around all of these artists, took her position as a Nahua weaver to also become like a storyteller artist in her own right, and started publishing, working with anthropologists. And I think her story is fascinating, but again, also thinking about the way that she was used, and very consciously used, performed, this idea of an indigenous woman, sort of what Mexico was hoping to sort of see in all their women and all their people, right? That this was the true kind of indigenous woman. So I sort of think about it, I've been teased in my life because of the way that I grew up, that I'm like the worst Mexican ever. So I'm like, if she was the best Mexican ever, I'm the worst Mexican ever, looking at her and thinking about like how I have fallen short from the symbol of what Chicana and Chicanismo was going to be out of the revolution. So yeah, but also trying to think about sort of if Diego Rivera was looking at her saying, this is weaving, and sort of painted a picture of her weaving, am I looking back then? And so this is my painting back to him of saying like, this is weaving. So yeah.
Now, you said that you learned the Mapuche vertical post loom. Is that still what you do now?
Yeah, so this is a Mapuche vertical post loom behind me, and all that is that it's very similar to the backstrap loom, except for that it is a frame post loom, and it's used instead of a backstrap because often you're weaving very heavy fabrics, saddle blankets, ponchos. The wool is way thicker, way more crude, right, than and sort of industrially carded or spun, or even even hand carded, the way that the sheep and that they're weaving in southern Argentina is sort of totally different than a lot of northern South America into Central America backstrap loom, and the kind of wool and alpaca that they're using. So yeah.
Where do you gather your weft? Where do you find all these incredible materials that you use?
Yeah, a lot of places, although I have to credit my my aunt is well, she's a bit of a clothes horse, but she's also, she loves fabric, and she and her sisters have gone, and anytime they're in India, are amassing clothes, and they're done with them, and they pass them on to me, and I very happily take these beautiful fabrics that they have worn and start turning them into yarn, into weft materials. And so I'm doing a lot of cutting on biases so that I minimize fray, because this is a lot of silk and a lot of rayon that starts quickly shredding. And so yeah, that's a lot of my weft material. And then also found climbing gyms. I like to climb in climbing gyms, so sometimes they're very nice and let me borrow and have rope.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot believe it, but it's time to end for today.
Oh,
Thank
no.
you so much for being here today.
Thank you. No, this was so much fun.
It was wonderful seeing your work, and I could talk to you forever. I want to hear more about the whole storytelling that you've done, and how storytelling and your weaving are so parallel, and you could just go on forever. So thank you so much for being here today. Yeah. If you would like to learn more about Kira and her work, please visit her website, KiraDominguezHultgren.com. She has some beautiful images there, and she will have information about her exhibits and where they are, and you can follow her and keep an eye on her. So I also want to say a big thank you today to our sponsor. Today we were sponsored by the Austin School of Fiber Arts, and they have a wonderful fiber program there, and you can sign up and get the latest information on their upcoming master classes or their lecture series. And their next workshop is the Kumihimo wire jewelry with Giovanna Imperia. So if you want more information, please go to her website, their website, austinschooloffiberarts.org. If you would like to sponsor Textiles and Tea, or your business or your guild, please go to our website and you can get more information there about being a sponsor. And Textiles and Tea is also generously supported by the donations to the Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, or the programming that we've got coming up this fall with Spinning and Weaving Week, please go to our website and support HGA by joining or donating, or both, at weavespindye.org. If you missed part of this presentation and you would like to see it again, please do so. Or you have a friend, you want to show it to them. All of our Facebook, all of our Textiles and Tea are recorded. You can watch them on Facebook. And then we're putting them up on YouTube as we go. And if you go to YouTube and you subscribe, you'll get a notice when the new episode is uploaded to YouTube. Next week, I'm very excited. We're going to have William Storms here, and he will be our guest. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It was a great afternoon. I hope you have a wonderful week. And again, happy tea.